It was about choice. That also is reflected in the name Open Option Parking. So there was this framing of it's not about getting rid of all parking, it's about giving folks choice over how much or how little they need.
Welcome to Reinventing Parking, the podcast about parking policy for anyone who wants a better city and better urban transport. Welcome back. I'm your host, Paul Barter. In June 2020, Edmonton, Alberta became the first major Canadian city to abolish its costly parking mandates, its minimum parking requirements, across the entire city, which actually accounts for 70% of the metropolitan area population. This parking change was given the interesting name Open Option Parking, and we'll be hearing more about the significance of that. This month, I'm talking with one of the key players in that campaign, Ashley Salvador, who is now an Edmonton City Councillor. But before her current role, she was an activist and the founder of the Canada Backyard Housing Association and co-founder of Yeg Garden Suites, an organisation promoting garden suites, otherwise known as accessory dwelling units, ADUs, sometimes called granny flats. So welcome to the Reinventing Parking podcast, Ashley.
Thank you so much for having me. Excited to be here.
Did I get that Yeg Garden Suites?
You did.
I think I had two G's maybe. There's only one G in there, Yeg Garden.
Yeah, no, you said it perfectly.
Are you still involved in that as well as being a councillor?
So I have stepped away, just given my role as a city councillor now, and just how busy that work is. And, the advocacy work that I did through Yeg Garden Suites, of course, really familiarized me with local government and just the importance of local decision making, and definitely got me passionate about eventually running for city council.
Was it your involvement in the ADU issue, the garden suites issue, that took you towards parking policy as an interest in your work?
Yeah, I would say that's a really big part of it. I'm an urban planner and I've always had an interest in land use, of course. But when it comes to the conversation around the elimination of parking minimums in particular, through my work with the Yeg Garden Suites, we'd often run into individual homeowners, Edmontonians, who would talk about how much of a barrier parking minimums were to their individual projects. I'd meet someone who lived just off of a rapid transit route, who was a cyclist and didn't even own a vehicle, and they were being forced to build parking into their backyard homes and into their ADUs. So that definitely got me more interested, more passionate about seeing that regulation changed.
The history of these campaigns is often a little murky, but in your own personal experience, where did it all begin?
As much as we're talking about this as sort of a single event, and absolutely the removal of parking minimums citywide was huge, I would say that the city of Edmonton in general has quite a progressive and forward-thinking outlook when it comes to urban planning in general. And over the years, we have been sort of slowly scaling back how much parking we do require on individual sites, going from 2 stalls per single family home down to 1. So there was an incremental element of it, but this is just one of those really big steps that needed to be taken in order to get to where we are today.
Was there a wider campaign, or did the initial impetus perhaps come from within the administration, the planners such as Anne Stevenson?
Yeah, so I think it's a number of things. Absolutely, having folks on administration like Anne, who is now my council colleague, which is just incredible. That absolutely helps drive the conversation. But I also think I would say like 2010s is when Edmonton really started to think about how we need to become a more dense, walkable, sustainable, both environmentally sustainable and fiscally sustainable city. And we started to really turn our focus towards infill development. How do we use land more efficiently? So it's also wrapped up in that larger conversation and larger narrative about how to build the city we want to see. And parking is a big part of that, because from a really sort of simple perspective, parking just takes up a lot of space. And from a purely sort of geographic perspective, parking forces us to spread our cities out. I remember there was a committee meeting at the time where council was going to be discussing parking reform. And it was a fascinating meeting because a lot of stakeholders actually came to speak in favor of loosening our parking regulations. Community members, local businesses, as well as industry. And there actually seemed to be a fair amount of alignment. But unfortunately, at the time, council decided to refer it back to administration for more work, which seemed so strange to me. It's not often you see that much alignment at these types of committee meetings. So when it got referred back, I thought to myself, that's going to need a bit of a push. So I recognized that the item would need, a bit of external support, sort of a bit of a champion on the outside to really help push it forward. Because I think there were fantastic people in city administration who wanted to move this forward. And sometimes when you're in the role of decision maker and in that council seat, you need, that external push and support along the way.
So that particular meeting you're talking about, was that the meeting in early 2020? Or is it a little bit earlier than that?
Yeah, it would actually have been earlier than that. And just for a bit of context, Edmonton, if you're not familiar with it, it is a prairie city, very spread out, very sprawling. We have room to spread out. There's no geographic boundaries that are stopping us from doing so, which is why historically we have seen that horizontal spread. So when we sort of made that shift in the early 2000s, I think that was a huge impetus behind this eventual move as well.
It seems like a very familiar kind of scenario where more than 80% or so of people travel to work by car. Public transport seems to me to be doing a little better perhaps than a typical North American car-dependent city, but not much better. Would that be about right?
Yeah. Because of the spread out nature of our city, we're definitely an auto-centric, auto-dependent city like many North American municipalities. But again, over the last decade, there has been that focus turned towards active modes as well as public transit. There's been some major investments in LRT in the city of Edmonton, to the point where we have a fairly good network, complemented by our bus network as well. And I think looking forward now, for a bit more context, we actually have a brand new city plan, which is our municipal development plan. And we have a target of actually reaching 50% of trips made by active and public modes. So we have ambitious plans. We're moving in that direction. And, it's so timely. We're, as my council hat speaking, but we're going to be going into budget in a few months. And I think that's where we need to see those values played out. We need to be investing in public and active transit in order to see that mode shift that's envisioned by the city plan.
That all sounds kind of progressive, right? And a lot of these issues have perhaps become entangled in culture war kind of politics, unfortunately. And this is where the Edmonton story is actually quite interesting, I hear. So perhaps can you give us some insight into the political complexion of this campaign? Because, in fact, it wasn't really about transit or bicycles or anything like that, was it? It was about more of this, something else. You tell us. What was it about?
It was about choice. And, that also is reflected in the name of open option parking. For a long time, and this is still the case in most municipalities, government is deciding how much or how little parking is appropriate based on what they have in their zoning bylaws. And we've heard time and time again that having that blanket approach doesn't always work. It doesn't work when it comes to parking. There's so many instances where not only folks who are trying to build ADUs, but even local businesses were being forced to overbuild parking. And that has serious financial consequences for their businesses. I think about developments that have not gone forward simply because of that overburden of having to require way too many parking stalls than they would want or need based on their target market. So it's about allowing for that enhanced level of choice so that individuals, businesses, property owners can make contextual-based decisions based on their needs. So having that framing of open option parking, I think was really, really helpful. Often when we talk about parking reform, there's a lot of fear in community. There's fear that there's going to be chaos and there's going to be no parking and you're not going to get to go where you need to go. So there was this framing of it's not about getting rid of all parking. It's about giving folks choice over how much or how little they need.
You're listening to Reinventing Parking, and I'm talking with Ashley Salvador about Edmonton's remarkable open options parking reform of 2020.
It may be helpful to provide a little bit of insight into sort of what that campaign looked like as well, and sort of how it rolled out. It actually started. I know I was sitting at home over the holidays about a month before this council meeting when we would be discussing parking, and I was thinking about how to best communicate this to Edmontonians, and ended up creating, honestly, a very simple visual of how much space is taken up by parking in our city. And oftentimes, I think people treat parking as a really benign thing, but until you see it and you can visualize how much space it takes up and how much land we've allocated to parking, it can be kind of hard to comprehend that. And so very low tech, literally just grabbed some screen captures of different neighborhoods in Edmonton, tried to get one of downtown, a mature neighborhood, more suburban context, and just overlaid some paint to show how much land is taken up by parking. And I remember seeing people's feedback, just seeing just the shock of how much space is devoted to parking. I think that helped. And also being able to talk about the dollars and cents. I would often reference the number $7,000 to $60,000 a stall, depending on the type of parking. And I found that those numbers really carried weight. We often see parking as just a given, but when we're actually applying a dollar figure to it and recognizing that those dollars and that cost is passed down to the groceries we buy, the rent we pay, the products we consume in our city, drawing that line for folks was very helpful too. So I guess taking it beyond parking, talking about the connection to housing affordability, the cost of living, health, how to ensure that we're having an equitable approach so that everybody can get around safely in ways that work for them.
It sounds like you appealed across the political spectrum. Alberta's a relatively conservative place in the Canadian context, but I imagine Edmonton, like any big city, is diverse and you have people of all political stripes. It sounds like the campaign was clever in that it actually appealed to various perspectives. Would that be right?
Very, very much so. And I think that's the interesting thing with parking reform is you can talk about it from an environmental perspective. You can talk about the sheer land area that parking takes up and what effect that has on our emissions. You can talk about it from a social perspective and a health perspective, even around social isolation. If we have a spread out city where we're auto dependent, we don't have those sort of casual interactions. It moves us away from creating those walkable mixed use neighborhoods. And then finally, from the financial perspective that I just outlined, to being able to tap into all of those arguments was very helpful in getting broad-based support.
One thing that people might be curious about is the geographic politics. How did that play out? Because, as I said in the introduction, Edmonton, the city council that you're in, covers quite a big percentage of the metro area. It's a little unusual in that respect. You've got suburbanites and inner city people all together.
Yeah, we definitely have a mix here in Edmonton. We have sort of that central core city. Then we have a really large swath of mature neighborhoods that were built out in kind of the 50s and the 60s. And then we have new suburban development at the fringes. And what's really quite interesting about that inner ring of 50s and 60s neighborhoods, they've experienced actually a loss of density, or population loss rather, over the last 40 years and kind of a hollowing out as people have aged out of those communities. And now we're starting to see more infill and more densification in these areas. And that is often where we get that parking anxiety because people see new homes going up. They worry about traffic in the neighborhood. They worry about sort of overburdening our street parking. But for this particular campaign, I actually wouldn't say there was a huge divide when it came to more of the urban mature neighborhoods versus suburban greenfield communities. At least not, it wasn't a big factor if it was there, which I think, speaks broadly to the way this issue was approached by the city and how it was framed around choice and being open option parking.
Interesting. And that reminds me, you and Anne and your partner in Yeg Garden Suites, Travis, did a webinar for Strong Towns, which I would urge the listener to go have a look at that because It's a deep dive into this whole story and provided some of the insights on what was going on inside council, inside the staffing side, and they were doing a lot of homework. The other useful thing about that webinar, which people should have a look at, is it's very visual. So you and Anne prepared a lot of really strong visuals that will give people a very clear perspective on what Edmonton is like and what these proposals involve. And the council staff seem to have done an amazing job at doing their homework, commissioning studies that were on target in terms of understanding what was going on and helping to alleviate fears, and then finally producing amazing materials that were very, very effective communication. To what extent was that vital? Or, there's outside pressure and then there's the inside story.
Oh, it was critical. I mean, I think that's the most important part. I was just an external cheerleader for good work that was already happening internally at the city. Okay. And there was one particular study. It was a technical evaluation of the use of parking lots in Edmonton at peak and off-peak times. And it actually showed that peak times were hitting about 50% usage, whereas optimal usage would be closer to like 80-90%. So being able to have that type of data at our fingertips to amplify and to really strengthen the case for why we should move to open option parking was an integral part of this push.
So in some ways that's encouraging. Many of our members of the Parking Reform Network and listeners to this podcast are insiders who are quietly working away, perhaps out of the public eye. And this is an encouragement. Your work is really important. And I guess for the outside cheerleaders like us, it's a lesson that we should not assume that government is kind of monolithic. Even if we see that we're not getting anywhere apparently, it would be wise to try really hard to open lines of communication to inside allies behind the scenes, perhaps.
Absolutely. And I think when I reflect on some of the bigger changes that I've seen happen in our city, I'm thinking about elimination of parking minimums, but also another example that comes to mind is when we eliminated single-family only zoning, sort of that confluence of having fantastic, amazing, talented folks on administration who are working on this, and then having community members who are able to champion this, but also industry at the table who can speak to more of that business perspective. That, in my experience, has been a really powerful way to get change happening.
Had that zoning change happened before the parking reform, the open option?
Yes, that had been in place for several years up to that point.
And was that a bigger fight than the parking fight?
See, I have less recollection of that one. But when it comes to infill, it has been done in a really, I would say, intentional but incremental manner in order to gain that buy-in. We had a roadmap, actually. It was called the Evolving Infill Roadmap. And it set the stage for, and set expectations for how our city is going to change over the coming years as we want to see more density in our neighborhoods. And changes like relaxing some of our zoning barriers, opening things up so that you could build more than just a single family home on all mature neighborhood properties. Those are the types of steps that I think even primed Edmontonians to start to be more welcome to these types of changes. And now we're going through a comprehensive zoning bylaw renewal where we're actually rewriting the entire thing and saying we want this to be simplified, we want it to be flexible, we want it to enable creativity in the type of development we see in order to facilitate the vision that's outlined in our city plan.
This is a slight detour from parking, but I've never been to Toronto, but I have the impression that Toronto is a place where you've got a lot of very low-rise, low-density zoned places. And then right next to them, often on corridors, subway corridors or other kind of transit corridors, you've got enormous high-rise. So there's this very sharp kind of distinction. And it sounds like perhaps Edmonton is heading in a slightly different direction with more missing middle and gentle density. Would that be right?
It's interesting when I think about Edmonton and its urban form. Like I said, we have sort of vast swaths of area that are considered mature communities, mature neighborhoods, built out in the 50s and 60s, low density. And we don't really have a tentpole style city where things get incrementally higher density as you get to downtown. It's kind of a donut where we have high density in our downtown and then it drops down to lower density single family homes. Then it actually bumps up in some of the suburban communities where we have put in place higher density targets. So there is a huge focus around missing middle. And I think about missing middle from a number of perspectives, missing middle in terms of the scale of building, but also missing middle in terms of affordability. A lot of the infill that we are seeing is quite expensive because of the limitations and restrictions that are still in place through our zoning bylaw. But also, I sometimes like to think of missing middle as sort of filling in that missing donut that Edmonton has as well.
As a planner, maybe you have your head around this better than someone like me. The parking part of this story seems to be especially important for unleashing missing middle. If I'm not wrong, the very big scale, like an enormous condo on a large plot, a high-rise condo on a large plot, yes, parking requirements, parking mandates will raise the price and cost of that, but it's less often will a project be completely stopped by the parking requirements, whereas it seems like a very large proportion of missing middle projects, these, maybe it's the duplex, triplex, sixplex, whatever, they just can't go ahead with requiring 2 stalls per unit. Am I getting that right?
Absolutely. I think about some of the missing middle projects that have been made, not viable because of our previous parking requirements. And those are the types of developments we say we want. We say we want sort of these mixed use missing middle projects. I can think about even like a 4-story project that has a little coffee shop on the main, some living above, and how challenging, if not impossible, that would have been with parking requirements in place. And I also think about, I have a number of stories in my head, but one sticks out in particular. A supportive housing project was, under our old requirements, was forced to build several $1 million parking lot, underground parking lot, because of those requirements. And the vast majority of residents who lived in the supportive housing project don't own cars. They don't drive. And this parking lot sits empty for the majority of the time.
For listeners in other countries, a supportive housing project, can you unpack that, the meaning of that?
Oh, sure. So supportive housing would be for folks who are houseless or at risk of houselessness, with wraparound mental health supports, addiction supports, wellness supports, all in one place.
So that's amazing that the parking mandates were still being imposed.
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of those really silly examples where it just does not make logical sense to do it, but since it is written in our zoning, there it is.
Things came to a head in the first half of 2020. So in that perhaps more heated period, how were some of the people who were worried about on-street parking impacts in their neighborhoods? How did you and also the city planners, how did they go about reassuring the people who had those worries?
Yeah, so we took the approach of just addressing those concerns pretty head on, and sort of dispelling some of those myths. I know we ended up putting out a number of graphics and infographics and some of those common concerns. And one of the ones we'd often hear is that if parking minimums are removed in my neighborhood, it's going to be really hard to find parking. But given the studies that were done by the city, we were able to point to, well, actually, there's an oversupply of parking in these communities. Also, many folks have garages that they don't use, and sort of dispelling some of those myths about who owns on-street parking. Because I think a lot of people assume that that's their stall and that's where they get to park. And honestly, that's typically, very easy to find. You can usually park outside your house in most of these neighborhoods. But sort of changing that narrative a little bit was helpful. I think the other really critical piece was talking about the pace at which this change would happen. Just because we make a bold policy change today doesn't mean that our neighborhoods are going to change the next day. This is the type of change that, if implemented at the level of policy, will take decades to really see the effects of. And that's exactly what we've seen. it's been a few years since this change has occurred. And absolutely, there have been projects that have gone ahead with no parking, with very little parking in very, good locations right next to transit. That makes a lot of sense. But our neighborhoods have not been, clogged with cars because of this change. So that was a really important part that we needed to convey to folks.
We keep saying it, but people still don't get it. But it's an intrinsically incremental policy, right? Like if we banned people wearing blue shirts tomorrow, then we would have almost no blue shirts after a little while if it was enforced. But with this policy, we changed the parking norms to zero. Open option doesn't mean zero parking in a few weeks' time.
Exactly.
People get confused.
Yeah. And same thing with businesses. We'd often hear, I need parking so that my customers can arrive, and so it's convenient, or else I'll lose my business. And always coming back to, we're not getting rid of your parking. It's just we're not requiring a set number of stalls. It's still your choice.
I guess people sometimes worry about evil or greedy developers, or just short-sighted developers perhaps making a mistake and underestimating how much parking demand there will be. I guess maybe this is a good moment we could ask what has happened in terms of how much parking are developers building in new buildings, and are there any signs of trouble? And if there are signs of trouble, is it being coped with easily, or are there some difficult cases which we perhaps should be aware of?
Yeah, it's a great question.
5 questions, I'm sorry.
Try to wrap that up. So I would say that the vast majority of projects that are coming forward that typically would have been required to build more parking than they wanted or needed are still building some parking. They're just not building as much. I think there's been just a handful of proposals that have zero parking. But in most cases, businesses, developers, landowners still recognize that people drive. And they're going to make decisions that are economic as well. And knowing that, and knowing that their market segment is still going to have some demand for parking, plays into their decisions as well. So that's the first part. And then the second part I actually haven't mentioned yet, but when it comes to our parking strategy more broadly, open option parking was a first really big step, but we're actually following that up with a curbside parking management strategy as well. So the timing of this is fantastic. Literally today, I'm on urban planning committee, and this was the item of the day. So we were talking about different actions that we're going to be rolling out over the next few years about how we manage our on-street parking assets, things like time-limited parking, different types of permitting, different types of technology, even looking at dynamic pricing as well for our parking, in recognition that having a one-size-fits-all for pricing across the board is not the most efficient or effective way to manage this asset. So I'm really looking forward to that subsequent body of work, because I think areas that are seeing increased parking pressure in our city, these are the exact types of tools that we need to be starting to look at sooner rather than later.
I'm curious, is there some rivalry between Edmonton and Calgary? You're both the big cities in the state of Alberta, and Calgary was ahead of you in terms of demand-based parking pricing, but you've beaten them to abolishing parking mandates and having open option parking. So now you need to catch up on the...
That's true. There's definitely a little bit of rivalry, friendly rivalry though. But I think it's actually just really fantastic that Edmonton was able to take this step and show leadership in eliminating parking minimums, because we has sort of set that bar, and it shows that it can be done. And other municipalities are now able to look at a major city like Edmonton and say, hey, if it's done there, it can be done here.
Is there any data yet about the impacts of the change on how many parking spaces get developed in real developments since the change? It's only 2 years, so it's perhaps early days yet.
Yeah, I would say early days. I've asked those types of questions, and I think we're still waiting for a little bit more of a sample to draw from, so that we can come out with some solid numbers. But I'm very curious to see myself. I would just say anecdotally from our public hearings, we do see applications coming forward on a very regular basis that are coming with little to no parking, as would have previously been required. And even thinking of examples that have come to multiple public hearings who would not have been possible under the previous regulations, and they've made that very explicit and very plain to council when they're presenting.
One other thing that I noticed as I was sniffing around trying to do research for this was that there's a new park in the downtown of Edmonton called Warehouse Park that used to be a surface parking lot. What's the story there, and does this have any relevance to this open option reform, or is it a different thing?
Yeah, so slightly different. But Warehouse Park is a really, really exciting park development happening in the central core of our downtown. I should provide this context as well, but Edmonton's downtown has a lot of surface parking lots, sort of just gravel parking lots, pretty bare bones. It takes up a lot of land. And the idea behind this park is to actually take a number of those parking lots that are right next to one another and turn them into almost like a central park for residents in downtown and visitors to our city. So very excited to see those parking lots being repurposed for a higher and better use that's going to serve the public good.
Was that already city-owned land, or was it a privately owned parking lot that was acquired?
Before my time, but my understanding is that this land was actually expropriated by the city of Edmonton.
So most of those downtown surface lots are privately owned.
That's right.
Commercial lots. So
yeah, that's right.
Are they charging for parking?
Yeah, and this is also interesting timing. I'm interested in having a conversation about how to phase out a lot of our downtown surface parking lots that the majority are privately owned. A lot of these landowners are holding on to these parcels, doing the bare minimum, not necessarily upgrading them to even be classified or permitted as a parking lot, literally just a gravel space and gravel lot. So I'd like to see us take a bit of a stronger approach to how we can incentivize redevelopment on those sites, because it's in prime locations right in our downtown core where we need to see density and where we need to see development.
I have a case study on my Parking Reform Atlas website, which is Montreal's approach to exactly that question. I'm sure you're aware of it, but they use a kind of a levy which they jacked up recently, and they've been gradually phasing out these downtown surface lots.
Yeah, and I'm very interested in potentially bringing something forward, actually, to one of our future council meetings to look at different types of approaches that we might be able to use here and best practices from other jurisdictions as to how they've dealt with this challenge as well.
Well, thanks, Ashley. It's been really interesting talking to you. And it's encouraging to hear that even a relatively conservative and very car-dependent place like Edmonton can make enormous strides in what most of my listeners will consider the right direction. So thank you for sharing your experience so far, and congratulations on the success and on being elected as a councillor, and keep up the good fight.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Had a fun time on the show. Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to the Reinventing Parking podcast, and I'm Paul Barter. You can find out more at reinventingparking.org, where you'll find ideas and tips on parking policy. You can also listen to other episodes, subscribe, or leave a comment. That's reinventingparking.org. Bye for now.